Welcome. I'm Lynn Roper, president of the Mari Sandoz Board of Directors. You all are joining us from coast to coast today, and actually 3 countries. Our UK people just signed on. We had over 160 registered for both days, so we are so glad you've joined us this evening, and I think you'll enjoy what you're going to hear. This is our first virtual Pilster Lecture and Sandoz Symposium. For over 30 years, the Mari Sandoz Heritage Society has hosted an annual conference at Chadron State College to discuss the books that Mari Sandoz wrote, to examine and learn more about the topics she wrote, the Native Americans, the homesteaders, the ranchers, and the history of the Great Plains. Mari Sandoz was born in 1896, south of Hay Springs in northwestern Nebraska. As a child, she listened to stories and began writing short stories. Moving to Lincoln in 1919, Mari became a writer of novels and a historian of the plains. She vividly described the culture of Native Americans, their persecution and near destruction of their culture. She also gave voice to the homestead experience and chronicled the people of the High Plains. She wrote more than 20 books and is particularly remembered for 2 biographies, Old Jules, her first work about her immigrant Swiss father who homesteaded in western Nebraska, and Crazy Horse, legendary leader of the Oglala Sioux. Sandoz was a teacher and a writer, even reading book proofs while she was dying of cancer in the New York City Hospital in 1966. She was the recipient of many accolades, and her bust stands in our state capitol rotunda for being named to the Nebraska Hall of Fame. The Mari Sandoz Heritage Society, founded nearly 50 years ago, works to build an appreciation of her body of work and to preserve the legacy of this premier historian by bringing people together for a discussion of her works. Today, 50 years after our founding, we host an annual lecture and symposium. We support the Story Catcher Writers Workshop each summer. We offer an annual research award, the Sandoz Scholar, and we publish through the Sandoz series a set of writings with scholarly essays on her work. The Society maintains extensive archive materials, including manuscripts, her research, her hand-drawn maps, copies of her voluminous correspondence and personal items, all of which are housed at the Mari Sandoz High Plains Heritage Center at Chadron State College. Please join us, support this work. Become a member of the Sandoz Society by going to the same website, marisandoz.org, that you used to register for this program. Your membership is vital in helping the Sandoz Society continue to maintain the legacy of Mari Sandoz. Next slide. This program is brought to you in cooperation with Humanities Nebraska, a statewide nonprofit organization inspiring and enriching personal and public life by offering opportunities to thoroughly engage with history and culture, with additional funding by the Nebraska Cultural Endowment. We also want to thank Southeast Community College in Lincoln for the technical support of our webinar today. Now, next slide, we usually have a book display and a book sale at our meetings, but today we have a virtual book exhibit from the University of Nebraska Press, part of Mari's books. And during the program, you'll be able to access this. Now, I'm happy to introduce Dr. Jillian Wenberg, a member of the Sandoz Society Board of Directors, who will present this year's Sandoz Scholar Award. Jillian?
Good evening and welcome to the Mari Sandoz Virtual Symposium. I'm so glad that you're here with us tonight, and I'm here tonight representing the Mari Sandoz Research Award Committee, comprised of Dr. Holly Boomer, Dr. Renee Logred, and myself, Dr. Jillian Wenberg. The Mari Sandoz Heritage Society encourages research on Mari Sandoz and her work by offering an annual research award of $1,000 for proposals that emphasize new insights into Sandoz or her approaches to her life and her work. The award recipient then presents that research at the annual Mari Sandoz Symposium, what you're seeing right now. We don't have a scholar presentation, a scholar award presentation this year, but we do have one next year, and I'm very excited to announce our award winner. If you're interested, though, before I unveil his name, I want to say that we are accepting applications for next year's award. That next year application time is July 31st, 2021, so put it on your calendar. If you have questions, access our website, or feel free to email me, and my email is listed on the website as well. I'm happy to answer any questions. And now, our unveiling of next year's award winner. The Mari Sandoz Research Award Committee is pleased to announce Brock Anderson as the 2020-2021 Sandoz Scholar. Mr. Anderson is currently enrolled in the UNK History Graduate Program with plans to defend his thesis by next summer. He is currently the Community Engagement Director at Trails and Trails Museum. And his stated research questions involve exactly how the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, quote, facilitated future interracial interactions in Sheridan and Dawes County communities, end quote. He will also examine, quote, the early 20th century interracial relationships in these Nebraska border towns. He plans to utilize the Nebraska State Historical Society, Sheridan County Courthouse archives, and our Mari Sandoz Heritage Center and to utilize that, and not only the Sandoz archives, but I was really interested in his use of the coffee and green files, also located at our Sandoz Center. Anderson will present next year, where I hope to see all of you next fall. Congratulations to Mr. Anderson, and thank you to all of our applicants for this year. It made for a very difficult decision for our committee. And now I'd like to introduce Shannon Smith. She is the Executive Director and CEO of the Wyoming Humanities Council. She is a historian and author of several works on women of the American West. In addition, she is also an active member of our Mari Sandoz board. Moderator.
Thanks, Jillian, and thanks, Lynn, for the great introductions, and welcome, everybody. I'm really excited to be here and thrilled to be the moderator for this great panel. So before I introduce our Pilster speaker and the panelists, I wanted to take just a really quick moment and do a little bit of housekeeping. Just so you all know, today's session is being recorded. So you'll all receive a link to the recording in an email in the next few days, and that'll also be available on the Mari Sandoz Heritage Society website. So we welcome you to revisit this content yourself, and please do share it with colleagues. Up in the top of your screen, and I don't know if I'm mirrored or not, so one of these corners, you'll see you have the options for how you're viewing us speakers. You can minimize all the speakers if you want to only see the slides as they're being used. And the other options change how many speakers you see at a time, and you can resize the window. So try them all out and decide what kind of mode you prefer. As audience members, you're all going to be muted throughout the session, but that doesn't mean you can't participate. We're really eager to hear your thoughts, receive your questions, and for you to tell us what you're thinking about as you're listening to these great experts share their wisdom. So I wanted to make sure you knew to submit a question, use the little chat button, which is at the bottom of your screen. It's the little talk bubble. And if you bring that up, you'll see chat and have the ability to send a question directly to the panelists or just write it out to everybody. And so you'll also be able to see who all is online with us here today. Kind of play around, look around at the bottom of your screen. You can click on the more and see what participants are here today. So just kind of familiarize yourself with Zoom for those of you who don't live on it like many of us are doing right now during this crazy time. So I also wanted to just remind you all that you will be receiving information about the society and about this session afterwards. So if you did not get signed up through an email, be sure and write into us and we'll make sure and double check. So put your name, put your email in our chat section if you don't think that you got hooked into this through directly registering. So now let's get started with our program. I'm really excited to moderate this discussion. Welcome to the 10th annual Pilster Great Plains Lecture and Panel. For a decade, we've featured some really amazing presentations, all in real life on the Chadron State College campus in Chadron, Nebraska. Today, as you all know, is our first ever virtual presentation. Esther Pilster was an elementary school teacher in Omaha and a principal, and a beloved one at that for 44 years. There's even a small park next to the elementary school she worked at all those years, named in her behalf. She had attended in 2002 the grand opening of our Mari Sandoz High Plains Heritage Center on the Chadron State campus. And she was so impressed by the purposes and goals of our organization that she subsequently made a gift to our organization of her husband's family's ranch north of Whitney, Nebraska. We were able to sell and convert that into an endowment, and this beautiful bequest is what helps fund us have these amazing presentations that she really wanted us to keep going in her honor, in her family's honor. So I'm really thrilled that we're able to bring this to many of you today. This year's topic explores Latino-Latina immigration in the West and Midwest, and our Pilster lecturer is Dr. Omar Valerio-Jimenez. Dr. Valerio-Jimenez is an associate professor of history at the University of Texas, San Antonio. He's a true product of the borderlands. He was born in Matamoros, Tamaulipas, Mexico, and he grew up in Taft, Corpus Christi, and Edinburgh, Texas. After graduating from MIT, he worked as an engineer for 5 years before attending UCLA, where he obtained his master's and doctorate degrees. He's taught courses on borderlands, Latinos, Latinas, immigration, race and ethnicity, and the American West at universities in California, New York, Texas, and Iowa. His first book in 2013, titled River of Hope, Forging Identity and Nation in the Rio Grande Borderlands, explores state formation and cultural change along the Mexico-United States border during the 18th and 19th centuries. His current book project, which sounds fascinating, is Remembering Conquest, Mexican Americans, Memory and Citizenship. And it analyzes the ways in which memories of the U.S.-Mexico War have shaped Mexican Americans' civil rights struggles, their writing, their oral discourse, and public rituals. His next project on the docket explores efforts of scholars to change the omissions and negative characterizations of Tejanos in the state's history and in public school textbooks during the mid-20th century. His talk today is an overview of his fascinating and very accessible paper titled Latinos, Migration in the Midwest. This is available on the Mari Sandoz Heritage Society website, on the Pilster Lecture webpage, and I'm going to, after I get done introducing here, I'll put a link to it in the chat area. After Dr. Valerio-Jimenez gives his talk, two esteemed colleagues will share their thoughts on his work and associate it within their own areas of scholarship and interest. So I don't really break the continuity of this discussion. I wanted to briefly introduce the two panelists now. Dr. Danielle Battisti is an associate professor of U.S. history at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, where she specializes in immigration and ethnic history. Her 2019 book, Whom We Shall Welcome, Italian Americans and Immigration Reform, examines both the liberal and conservative elements of Italian American efforts to influence American immigration policies in the 1950s and 60s. Whom We Shall Welcome was awarded the 2019 Best First Book Award from the Immigration and Ethnic History Society. Dr. Kurt Kimbacher is an associate professor of history at Chadron State College. He has served on the Mari Sandoz the Mari Sandoz Heritage Society Board since 2013. He has chaired the Pilster Lecture and Sandoz Symposium Committee since 2016. He completed his PhD at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln in 2006 and is the author of Urban Villages and Local Identities, Germans from Russia, Omaha Indians, and Vietnamese in Lincoln, Nebraska. He's also the author of several articles and book chapters that focus on identity construction, human migrations, and region.
Okay, great. All right. Well, I'd like to thank the Mari Sandoz Heritage Society for the invitation today, and specifically Elizabeth Chase and Dr. Kurt Kinbacher for making the arrangements. I'd also like to thank you all, the virtual audience, for attending my presentation via Zoom. I'll be giving a brief summary of my essay, which will be published in the Oxford History of the Midwest, which is an anthology that's being edited by John Locke. So, I began my essay that Shannon referred to, that's available on the website, with the vignette of Latino farmers in Michigan to emphasize three main points. The first point is that Latinos are not recent immigrants to the Midwest. They have lived and worked in the Midwest since the late 19th century. And as Shannon mentioned, I used to teach at the University of Iowa, and when I lived there for 9 years. One of the things that often I was sort of told when people would meet me is, oh, they would ask me if I was a recent immigrant, or they would tell me about some recent immigrants. And there was sort of this belief that Latinos have just arrived in the last 10 years, say. And this is part of what I want to sort of emphasize in my essay, that they haven't. They've been in the Midwest since the late 19th century. The second point is that the Midwest is not a homogeneous white heartland. It's often referred to as the heartland of America, right? But it also has pockets with ethnically and racially diverse populations. Latinos have been contributing to the labor force and culture of the Midwest since their arrival in the late 1800s. And then the third point I wanted to make was that the Latino population of the Midwest, like in the rest of the nation, has an internal diversity, not only by class, but also by ancestry. In other words, not all Latinos in the Midwest are Mexican immigrants. So jobs in agriculture and railroads attracted the first ethnic Mexicans to the Midwest. And I'm using the term ethnic Mexicans to refer to both Mexican immigrants, who are still Mexican citizens in many cases, and Mexican Americans, who are US citizens but of Mexican ancestry. So prior to World War I, most agricultural migrants were temporary residents and not permanent settlers. Most were single men or married men traveling without their families. They took part in circular migration by returning to Texas or Mexico after seasonal harvest. Sugar and railroad companies recruited unaccompanied men on purpose, partly to depress wages by not paying them enough to support their families, and also to appease local residents in the Midwest who worried about ethnic Mexican laborers becoming permanent residents. So the Mexican Revolution, approximately that began in 1910, it lasted about 10 years, pushed more immigrants to the US, including to the Midwest. And employment opportunities created by the US entry into World War I them north. So there was this sort of push-pull factor of bringing Mexican immigrants into the US. Mexicans gradually replaced European immigrants in the sugar beet industry of the Midwest as the latter became farmers and industrial laborers. Ethnic Mexicans traveled to the Midwest via railroads, as you can see on this map, after they were actively recruited by employers who viewed Mexico as a convenient labor source because of its close proximity and abundance of workers willing to migrate. Recruiters from sugar and railroad companies often traveled to cities along the US-Mexico border, places like El Paso and Laredo, to offer recently arrived immigrants and Mexican Americans labor contracts to work in the Midwest. In the early 1920s, ethnic Mexican families began arriving in the Midwest due to a change in the recruiting strategies of the agricultural and railroad industries. Sugar companies like the Great Western began recruiting married men with families, believing them to be more stable than the unaccompanied men who frequently changed jobs. Railroad companies like the Santa Fe Railroad also began recruiting married men with families to promote loyalty. So they wanted to avoid hiring workers who changed jobs frequently, single workers. And they also wanted to prevent unionizing, based on the belief that married men might be less likely to go on strike because they had dependents. The arrival of families led to more permanent settlement of ethnic Mexicans in the Midwest, and the creation of Mexican enclaves, ethnic enclaves. These Mexican neighborhoods were usually near immigrants' workplaces. This led to the growth of boxcar communities and shanties near agricultural fields. Immigrant laborers relied on social networks to obtain information on industrial and agricultural jobs after abandoning their contracts. They acquired job information from Spanish language newspapers, through word of mouth, and from potential employers. Turnover in railroad and agricultural jobs remained high as ethnic Mexican laborers left for higher paying jobs and more stable urban jobs, which were non-seasonal. As they traveled from one job to another across the Midwest, across the Southwest, and then into the Midwest through a process of step migration, immigrants learned more English, they acquired new skills, and they forged social networks with other itinerant Mexican laborers. For ethnic Mexicans, the Midwest was appealing because it offered higher wages and less overt racism than Texas, which was often the first place they settled in when they came to the U.S. Some immigrants moving to rural areas in the Midwest also liked the slower pace of life, which was similar to life in their rural hometowns. And I'll have to say that this is also continues to be the case where you have a lot of immigrants, both Mexicans and Central Americans or migrants, who are arriving in the Midwest. And often when people interview them and ask them why they've moved, say, from Los Angeles or from the East Coast or the Southwest to the Midwest, they often cite not only obtaining higher wages, but also the slower pace of life and the sort of the family values that they see in the Midwest compared to perhaps in an urban environment of the coastal cities. Both the U.S. government and Midwestern residents racialized ethnic Mexicans as non-whites who were not welcomed as permanent residents. In response to growers' requests, the U.S. Department of Labor waived the 1917 Immigration Act's head tax and literacy requirement for Mexicans. It also allowed for the temporary admission of Mexican laborers and their families for 6 months as contract agricultural laborers. It restricted their employment to farm work, and the law also prohibited laborers from becoming U.S. citizens. So, and instead of encouraging workers to buy houses, employers provided free or rental housing for Mexican immigrants because they, like the U.S. government officials, racialized Mexicans as temporary workers. The majority white population of the Midwest also viewed Mexicans simultaneously as non-white and as non-black. And they viewed them, but they also viewed them as foreign workers. Now, gradually, ethnic Mexican workers leaving agricultural and railroad work for industrial jobs that provided higher wages, stable employment, and benefits. World War II created new employment opportunities for Latinos as European Americans left civilian jobs to join the military. For the agricultural industry, the shortage of workers was acute because many rural laborers moved to urban areas. To address this labor need, the U.S. and Mexico established a guest worker agreement, the Emergency Farm Labor or Bracero program, in 1942. This program supplied male guest workers to the agricultural and railroad industries. The Bracero program would be extended several times until 1964, as employers became dependent on contract laborers who would return to Mexico after completing their contracts. In the aftermath of the war, Puerto Rican contract laborers joined Mexican braceros in the Midwest. As part of a program called Operation Bootstrap, and as an effort to control the island's quote-unquote overpopulation, the Puerto Rican government sent male seasonal contract agricultural laborers and female domestic servants to the mainland United States. Midwestern communities such as Chicago, Milwaukee, and Gary, Indiana, provided some of the first opportunities for interactions between ethnic Mexicans and Puerto Ricans. Puerto Ricans, like Mexicans, experienced a similar process of racialization as they were considered non-whites and non-blacks in housing, in employment, and in migration policies. Two immigration laws significantly transformed the U.S. Latino population beginning in the 1960s. For a variety of complex reasons, the Immigration Act of 1965 radically reshaped the composition of subsequent immigrants. Prior to the 1970s, most immigrants were from Europe or Canada. But by the 1970s, half of the immigrants to the US were from Latin America, a third from Asia, and the rest from Europe and Africa. The second transformative law was the Immigration Reform and Control Act, or IRCA, of 1986. This law legalized some 2.3 million undocumented immigrants who had been in the country since 1982, and it also established employer sanctions. The passage of IRCA signaled a new era in which the U.S. increasingly relied on the militarization of the U.S.-Mexico border to decrease undocumented immigration. Now, this strategy change by the federal government had the unintended consequences of encouraging undocumented laborers to remain in the U.S. longer. It also encouraged them to establish permanent residency, and it led to them becoming more regionally dispersed beyond the Southwest. Finally, this strategy also changed the immigrants' composition from a seasonal, rural, and predominantly male labor force to a permanent, urban, and increasingly female population. The Latino population grew mostly through immigration from 1980 to 2000, but since then has grown mainly as a result of native birth, as tougher border enforcement and hostile immigration laws have been implemented. So since 2000, the Latino population has grown basically through natural reproduction. The arrival of various Latino subgroups in the Midwest has made the region an exemplary location for the development and growth of intra-Latinos, a term that was coined by scholar Francis Aparicio to describe Latinos of mixed nationalities. Beginning in the 1970s, Central Americans, South Americans, and Caribbean immigrants began joining Mexicans and Puerto Ricans in various Midwestern cities. As they lived and worked alongside each other, they intermarried with other Latinos. Intermarriage led to the establishment of new Latino identities, as the offspring of Mexican and Puerto Rican parents began identifying as Mexicans or Puerto Mexas. Similarly, youth began identifying as Mexi-Guatemalans or Cuban Ricans. The growth of the Latino population significantly influenced the demographics and culture of the Midwest as they have become the nation's largest minority group. By 2018, Latinos made up 18.3% of the nation's population, or some 60 million people. And most lived in one of 9 states with long-standing Latino communities, including Illinois. Now, while the nation's Latino population grew by 43% from 2000 to 2010, it increased by more than 73% in 8 of 12 Midwestern states. In 2018, Latinos made up 7.7% of the region's population, the population of the Midwest, and they are the largest minority population in Iowa, Illinois, and several other states in the region. So the increasing Latino population in the Midwest impacts regional politics, as is evident in ongoing debates about voter registration, immigration policy, and language acquisition. And this became really apparent in 2005 when there was these large immigration protests across the U.S., but some of them were centered in Chicago and other Midwestern cities in response to the potential passage of the Sensenbrenner bill. Latino history, acculturation, and political involvement are therefore relevant and timely topics for K-12 educators, policymakers, and university populations seeking to understand the changing profile of the Midwest. And I'll leave you here with this image of an anthology that I co-edited while I was at the University of Iowa with my colleagues Santiago Vaquero Vasquez and Claire Foxx, who were at the University of Iowa with me. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Omar. That was just fascinating. And I really did enjoy reading your paper. And as I shared that link with everybody, I just can't recommend it highly enough. It was very accessible for non-scholars and people who are just interested in noting how Mexican-American immigration has occurred in this region. Why don't we move on and then start taking questions after the panelists kind of share some of their thoughts and kind of place what they've read in your work, Omar, into the kind of work that they do. So I'd like to pass the baton on to you, Danielle, and get some of your feedback.
Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. Thank you, everyone in the Sandoz Center for making this virtual lecture possible and for the invitation. And thank you, Dr. Valerio-Jimenez, for your wonderful paper, situating Midwestern Latinx experiences for us in a historical context, a long historical context reaching back into the 19th century. I saw something in that paper, which I think emerges as a central theme or tension maybe, and that is the question, to what extent do we talk about or situate the Mexican, because most of this paper is about Mexican migrants specifically rather than a pan-Latinx view, immigration experience in the broader context of American immigration history? And to what extent do we talk about that migration as a distinct phenomenon stemming from the US and Mexico's interconnected histories, shared geographies, and special, for better or worse, relationship? So that's sort of the question I want us to be thinking about. If we travel chronologically back to the beginning of your paper, you show us how Mexican migrants seeking work in the railroad, sugar beet, and other Western industries were part of a larger movement of global migrants, pushed and pulled by the rhythms of the Industrial Revolution and globalization in the late 19th century. Like their Asian and European counterparts, mostly young men conferred with their families and their extended households to collectively make the decision to migrate in the hopes of providing for those that stayed back home. Their intention was to stay in the United States for a season, a year, maybe several, in order to buy land in their hometowns, make improvements on their farms, afford their daughters' dowries or sons' educations. Some struck out on their own, perhaps encouraged by the advice and aid found in letters and remittances sent back home to relatives, and others were spurred on by news networks of co-villagers. Other migrants were aided by the semi-formal labor networks that formed in the shape of the Chinese Six Companies or the Padrone systems that functioned in Italian, Greek, and to a lesser extent, Mexican migration networks until they were banned by Congress in the late 1870s. Those labor agents, working in collaboration with American corporations, assisted in transoceanic travel and transcontinental travel. They secured jobs for migrants and kept a steady stream of cheap labor flowing to farms, mines, and factories of the Midwest and the nation, all for a cut of laborers' paychecks, of course. Also, like other global migrant groups whose members possessed limited capital and few non-agricultural skills in this era, Mexicans were encouraged to leave their homelands and strike out in global markets by domestic policy changes in their homelands that adversely affected them. And here we're often talking about development or modernization policies in one's home state. In some cases, the state even took an active hand in encouraging emigration and the flow of remittance money that would come back to develop immigrant homelands. In these ways, Mexican immigrants, or better yet, migrants' stories resembled or paralleled those of their Southeastern and even Asian counterparts, with some key differences, of course, but the similarities are significant and relevant and worth talking about. We see a divergence, though, when the issue of permanent resettlement comes into play. As Dr. Valerio-Jimenez recounts to us, World War I represents a turning point of sorts. In this era, mobilization for war cut off America's supply of European migrants. Domestic labor shortages and a booming manufacturing sector encouraged more Mexican migration, and national security concerns prompted a tightening of borders and the first real efforts to systematically regulate immigration and deportations. In this environment, seasonal labor circuits slowed or closed as more migrants became immigrants. Also, by this time, racist or discriminatory practices and racist immigration laws had already drastically reduced the flow of Asian migration to the United States, and American nativists had set their sights on assimilating or limiting the influence of, in their eyes, not quite white groups such as Southern and Eastern Europeans and Mexicans in the United States. However, while some native-born white Americans might have been suspect of groups like Italians and deemed these groups as undesirable immigrants and future citizens, they never subjugated Southern and Eastern Europeans to anti-miscegenation laws, Jim Crow laws and customs, with maybe the exception of Sicilians in New Orleans, and forms of voter suppression endemic to the Southwest and the Midwest. And here I'm thinking about things like delaying New Mexico's statehood until the 1920s, when a critical mass of white or Anglo settlers had moved in. Or if you take a look at Midwestern states like I did here, Michigan, a bunch of Midwestern states had a practice of allowing intending citizens to vote. So you could go down as an immigrant to your local courthouse and register and say, one day I plan to naturalize. And Michigan allowed this up to 1894, Minnesota allowed this up to 1898, and Nebraska, Kansas, and South Dakota up to 1918. And when I go down to the Douglas County Historical Society, I don't see ethnically Mexican names in those intending registers. I see German and Czech names and so forth, right? So I think there are some critical differences here. These practices produced significant differences in Euro-American and Mexican-American experience in the Midwest and elsewhere. Despite Mexican Americans' legal status as whites, they're often racialized as non-white in their local communities and in state practices. The consequences for Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans in the Midwest are stark. Although Dr. Valerio-Jimenez points out that Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans increasingly settled as family units and had begun to form ethnic enclaves in both rural and urban settings like other ethnic groups in this region in the early 20th century, that social integration didn't always translate into political integration. Southwestern and Midwestern communities hardly encouraged Mexican naturalization, civic engagement, and voting. Instead, they continued to promote the transnational connections and identities that we learned about in today's presentation. The result of this outsider status and political marginalization on the whole was that Mexican Americans were harder hit than their Euro-American counterparts by the time of the Great Depression. Furthermore, when that crisis hit, Southwestern and Midwestern social workers, local government relief officials, and the INS on a federal level all cooperated to encourage or force so-called voluntary repatriations to Mexico, oftentimes by native-born but ethnically Mexican citizens. Even though Euro-American immigrant groups continued to maintain the same transnational networks in this period, they didn't face this same kind of marginalization and exclusion as Mexican immigrants and their children did. Euro-Americans were generally encouraged to assimilate, naturalize, and integrate into the American mainstream, and it paid dividends for them during the New Deal. I know I should be plugging my own book, but I cannot recommend highly enough this one called 3 Worlds of Relief by Sybil Foxx, where she talks about the divergent experiences of Euro-American immigrant groups, Mexican-American groups, and African-Americans during the New Deal, who benefited from the social welfare policies that were passed, and how did that happen. What we see is that Euro-Americans were rewarded with jobs, housing, social security benefits, because they used ethnic voting blocks in urban centers to their advantage. They pressed lawmakers to pass relief for their benefit and to include their non-citizen parents in social security relief. I could go on and on with different kinds of benefits that Euro-Americans secured during the Great Depression. But with Mexican Americans not being a viable political bloc in either the Midwest or the Southwest, this did not happen. And in fact, what we see is not just a lack of benefits, but a writing out of domestic and agricultural workers from the Social Security Act and other social welfare benefits, right? Instead, they are targeted by these repressive measures like so-called voluntary repatriation. This constant insider-outsider status that Hispanic Americans have experienced is also perhaps epitomized in the Bracero program, which we heard about in the presentation. Although the Bracero program facilitated the migration of hundreds of thousands of Mexicans into the United States in the 20th century, it did so by revoking a ban on foreign contract labor and producing a sort of second-class citizenship at best, where temporary workers were confined to economic marginalization, unfair contracts, substandard housing and welfare, and workers occupied a liminal space politically as foreign contract workers rather than future citizens. All of these factors made Mexican American and Puerto Rican American integration in the Midwest more difficult. And think about the absurdity of that statement for Puerto Rican Americans for a minute, right? So this was sort of a best case scenario outcome of the Bracero program. On a far more problematic level, flaws in the program's structure and policing facilitated and even encouraged unauthorized migrations that further eroded Mexican Americans' political and social integration in this region. I find it really interesting to think about whether or not there are really labor shortages in this area. Historian Cindy Hahamovich has argued that there were not, in fact, labor shortages during World War II, but that growers inflated the need for laborers in order to keep an oversupply of labor and to keep a marginalized workforce in the region. I'll end my comments with the 1965 Immigration and Citizenship Act and the consequences it's produced for Latino Americans, because I think immigration policy is another area where we must ask, do Latin American experiences mirror those of other immigrant groups, or is there a distinct history and set of geopolitical concerns that must come into play when crafting the state's immigration laws? Reforms in 1965 ended racially discriminatory national origins quotas by providing each country in the world with up to 20,000 immigrant visas each year. However, that legislation also ended the open access to immigration that Western Hemisphere migrants had historically enjoyed and relied upon. Some scholars, perhaps most notably May Nye, have questioned the intent and utility of those reforms when it comes to U.S.-Latin American relations, especially in the case of Mexico. With a history of cross-border migrations, chain migration networks, a shared border, increasingly integrated economies, and push-pull factors that continue to encourage Mexican and, to a lesser extent until more recently, other Latin American migrations, the perhaps predictable result of these legislative changes has not been an annual cap on migration, but the rise of unauthorized migration. This final piece of the puzzle, I think, suggests a clear tipping of the scales when it comes to our original question. To what extent do we understand Latin American experiences in the Midwest as similar or different from those of other immigrant groups? And I could certainly go on about immigration reform for a long time, but I won't. So I'll let Dr. Valerio-Jimenez comment on these and other points that you'd like to raise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Danielle. And Omar, before we jump in and have both of you answer, I'd like to introduce Kurt into the conversation and have him share a little bit about what he thinks how this ties in a little bit with Mari Sandoz and the work that we do at our society, and see if we can draw some, connect some dots. So Kurt, I'll pass the baton on to you now.
Thank you, Shannon. I'm going to attempt to share a screen here. Can you see my screen, Shannon? Okay. First, I want to start, well, this is Mari and me at virtual graduation back in May, and we are still semi-virtual here. We're meeting face-to-face with our students, virtually with all of you. And I really want to thank Omar and Danielle for being so flexible and joining us virtually when we are hoping to have you out here in person, and that goes for tomorrow's panelists as well. And I want to compliment you all on your scholarship. I think it's been fantastic. I will also want to say thank you everyone for attending. It's a beautiful late summer day here in Chadron where you might have been had things been different. And welcome. My job is to try to connect Mari Sandoz to this discussion on immigration. And I want to pull a couple of themes across from Omar's work. Community, and that includes residential segregation, to be sure, and racialization. And the methodology behind all of this, well, I got a pile of Sandoz books this summer and just started mining them for immigrants. And I expected to find some immediately, but if you're familiar with their work, we don't have a book that is The Immigrants, which would have made my life a lot faster. But instead, I'll come back to these works in a moment. And then I read Omar's wonderful paper. If you haven't read it, please by all means do. Then at Mike Smith's suggestion, he's a board member, he said, well, maybe take a look at Renee Lagrave's article from 2007, where she wrote about the good, the bad, and the ignored immigrants in Willa Cather's work. And then I tried to throw it all together. But before we really get into immigrants, I think one of the amazing things about Sandoz's work is she recognized the polyglot nature of North America. There's not a lot of immigrants in the cattlemen or in the buffalo hunters, but really not in the beavermen either. But she does discuss the vaqueros out in California and this cattle work. And Frenchmen are just crawling all over the beavermen world, and that certainly helps old Jules, and we'll come to him here in a little while because the Ogallala run into him and recognize him as French, Swiss French. And the cattlemen, I'm surprised at her work. I mean, she's so thorough in these big histories. She doesn't bring in the Hispanic cowpunchers that would have been present. But her view of the Great Plains, her view of America is certainly polyglot, and historically she's very opposed to this racialization movement that goes on. But as Omar writes in his work, he says the frequent references to the Midwest as the heartland and U.S. popular and mass culture bring to mind archetypes associated with rural and small town setting populated by descendants of European settlers. And in most of her work, including this trilogy, we clearly see that she deals with a North American in a different way. Now, more specifically to immigrants and her first work, which I hadn't read in really a long time. So when I sat down to look at it, I knew there would be immigrants there because, of course, Jules is an immigrant. But reading it, what brings me to mind is also Omar's work, because he wrote about racial scripts in his essay. Quoting Omar, white Midwesterners' racial views were influenced by their reliance on racial scripts, which are the ways in which we think, talk, and act toward on racialized group based on our experiences with other groups whose race differs from our own. Not the best reading, but racial scripts are hugely important here. And Jules is writing about, well, right where I'm sitting and right where Shannon is sitting, and the late 19th century movement of a lot of people from the United States, but also from all over the rest of the world into what's now this western panhandle of Nebraska. There were not a lot of Latinos in old Jules. In fact, to find any reference of Mexicans at all, I found one. And it is exactly this racialized script. So in this up and down world of settlement where the cowmen and the sheepmen are always at odds with each other, there was violence. And one of the cattlemen is commenting about sheep raising. They're going to bring in, and these are Mari's words, gun-toting Mexicans to help settle the situation. Other than that, I don't find really any evidence of Latino migration up at this point. Now, it's not that there aren't in Nebraska. I think they're a little bit farther south. But again, this is a racialized world, and Sandoz recognized this when she was writing. There is one reference to an African American. He is Andy Brown, and in her words, the yellow boy, a light-skinned black man from Virginia. And we know that Mari's mom, really didn't like him because of his color. And he's around for a little while, and then he's out of the story. He got into some accusations of theft. Other, I guess in Renee's terms, the bad immigrants. Poles show up. They are described in Old Jules as Poles were fools for whiskey and the accordion. If we want to have good, bad, and ignored, I guess fool would be bad. Whiskey, well, maybe good. Accordion, possibly ignored. Bohunk Jim shows up as a child molester. So again, the Eastern European racialization. And to a certain extent, Jules himself is racialized, or at least discriminated against because of his immigrant heritage. He's referred to several times as dirty foreigner and as damned foreigner. So there is kind of the whole notion in the late 19th and early 20th century that all foreigners are somehow problematic. Jules himself preferred in his recruiting efforts Germans, French, Swiss Germans, and just kind of Swiss in general. And Omar pointed out that the Mexicans, when they were found with European immigrant groups, were with Southern and Eastern Europeans and not these groups. So there's a racial hierarchy. And there's certainly racialization in old Jules' story, which is not directly about immigrants, but you just can't avoid them. The other work that I found quite a lot of discussion about immigrants was the capital city, or capital city. And in this case, it's Poles in capital city. I like this book a lot. I always have, partly because they're set in Franklin, Kanawha, which is a little bit of a misnomer. I mean, Kanawha would be Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, all rolled into one state. And in reality, this is, in most respects, Lincoln, Nebraska. When I was doing research in Love Library years ago, before I had a camera on my phone, or maybe a phone in my pocket, I ran into a map in Mari Sandoz's papers down there that was a drawing of Franklin, Kanawha. And it's essentially Lincoln turned 90 degrees on its axis. And in this city, there's a Polish Bottoms. So an immigrant neighborhood, and this comes to community, but it also comes to racialization. Like Mexican neighborhoods, these are established communities. And in this community of Franklin, the Poles were labeled Reds and undesirables. Now, this is the 1930s that this book is set in. But these are the German Russians, the Volga-Deutsch, the Protestant, 25% of the Lincoln population that shows up and forms immigrant neighborhoods. The Poles on the bottom, according to Sandoz's writing, were kept to their foreign ways, which is typical of first-generation immigrants. And the Polish character of note is Hattie Krasinski. She's described as the little gold digger. She's involved in a tryst with one of Lincoln's leading citizens, and she's both racialized and then brought in as like the villain in this relationship. So it's an interesting story. She's described as the despised Polak, a daughter of scrub women, gardeners, and fixmen. Now, again, this is the racialization from the community, not from Sandoz, because she portrays Hattie and the Bottoms in a much more positive light. And part of this is autobiographical, I think. She writes about Hattie, who was a young woman at the time, growing up in this Polish neighborhood and taking care of like the 6 younger siblings, which Mari certainly could relate to. And I've talked a little bit with one of our board members who knows a lot about Lincoln, Jameson Wyatt's at class right now. I'm wondering, Hattie, is this Hattie Plum Williams in disguise? She wrote about the Russian Bottoms as a sociologist in 1909 and 1906. But Hattie's portrayed as less than a gold digger. In fact, she's the one with a heart of gold. And in her minds, the older Poles were industrious and adaptable. But again, in real life, this is the Russian bottoms. And these are people that come out to Western Nebraska as well, and they do have contact with Mexican populations. And the place is sugar beets. The Lincoln German Russians got on trains annually and went out to Gering and places like this, and even on to Colorado, where the sugar beet industry was going. And like Mexicans, they did that really hard beet field labor in the early years, and they actually worked not side by side, but for the same companies. And as the Mexicans were new in this world, were viewed as non-white, not black, but also foreign, we're going to see this over and over again in Western Nebraska, and there'll be a panel on that tomorrow. Vicki will discuss Japanese. They're in the beet fields as well. And when we look at kind of this whole population, these people came and they stayed. And there's Japanese in that region, there's Volga Deutsch in that region, there's Mexicans in that region, but when they are working in the beet field industry, there is a racial hierarchy. The German Russians are at the top of the racial hierarchy, but they're still racialized. They have substandard living systems. It's the whole family out in the fields, but they have the best contracts. The Japanese are a little bit below them. And the Mexican workers have, and the Native American workers as well, are at the bottom rung, where they have to do more work for really less wages and fundamentally worse conditions. So, Omar brings up, a lot of things that I found very connecting to, well, Mari's work, and apparently to mine as well. And I'll close here because I really want people to have a chance to ask Omar and Danielle some questions, because I think their work is really outstanding. But here at the Sandoz Society, we often discuss things in the spirit of Mari Sandoz. And it's sort of a rhetorical question I'd like to close with: when will this racialization end? Certainly for Poles and the Volga Germans, it has. For Mexicans in the Midwest, probably not as much. But I think in Sandoz's mind, even when she was writing Old Jules, the answer would be, well, never soon enough. I want to thank everyone, and I will now unshare my screen, if I can.
Thanks, Kurt, and all three of you. I think you have a lot of overlap in how you presented your interests and what you're working on. Before I ask you all to kind of perhaps select a question you might have for each other, I thought I would go through. We did get a question and kind of a follow-up question, and I think it came out of towards the end of Danielle's discussion, but I think both Danielle and Omar could probably address this. And this was about the repatriation during the Great Depression, and to what extent was this, sometimes coercive, and did they, like we have seen in current days, did they in these sweeps get rid of, try to push out legitimate residents or even American citizens?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Yes, so the so-called voluntary, or the repatriations during the Great Depression were both sort of so-called voluntary and forced deportations throughout the U.S. And so one of the things that occurred is employers started laying workers off, right, during the Great Depression. And many times Mexicans would be the first laid off because in some cases they lacked seniority. They were the first fired because they were the last hired in some ways, right? But also because sometimes employers would say, we want to reserve these jobs for American workers. And Mexicans were seen as foreign workers in many cases. So that was part of the reason. Another reason they would leave, Mexicans would leave sort of voluntarily, and I put that in quotes, is that they often had trouble finding work once they were laid off. And then finally, the social service agencies as well as charities would often encourage Mexicans to leave by telling immigrants that they would not be receiving aid in the future. Like if they came looking for aid for food or clothing or something like that, they would tell them, the social service organization would say, well, you're going to get aid this week, but in the future you're not going to get aid because we're reserving this aid for U.S. citizens. So that was some of the ways that Mexican immigrants were encouraged to voluntarily leave. In other parts of the country, I'm not sure how much this happened in the Midwest, but in other parts of the country, like in California, some social service agencies and some local governments would instead of giving immigrants during the Great Depression, Mexican immigrants aid, they would say, we'll pay for your bus travel or train travel out of the county, so that basically they weren't going to rely on the social services in that county. They weren't going to be a drain on those social services. And then there was other, so in larger cities of the Midwest, like Detroit, there were these sort of more targeted deportations. And many times the people who were targeted for deportation were any workers who might have been involved in any kind of labor organizing. So those were going to be, seen as sort of prime targets. And then whether or not U.S. citizens were deported or repatriated. And there's definitely evidence that there were throughout the U.S. And including the Midwest, partly because if, I mentioned how throughout the 20th century, more and more immigrants started bringing their families, and some of them established families in the U.S. They might have, a Mexican immigrant might have married a Mexican-American woman, right? And so you have these families being created, and they are mixed status families, what we would call mixed status families, meaning some of the family members are U.S. citizens, some might be permanent residents, and some remain Mexican nationals, remain non-citizens. And so when a family member was deported, not only sometimes was there a sort of the split of families, right? Family separation, but in some cases, in so-called voluntary repatriations, entire families would leave, and including Mexican American children or U.S. born children of Mexican parents. So in some cases, there were Mexican Americans or U.S. citizens who were deported or repatriated, both types. So that's how I would answer that question. In places like, I know because I was living in Iowa, for those 9 years, and I did some research on it. Iowa, for example, didn't undertake any sort of aggressive repatriation process during the Great Depression, but there weren't that many Mexican Americans in Iowa compared to, say, Illinois. So the states that had the larger Mexican American populations, or Michigan, are going to sort of aggressively try to deport Mexicans during the Great Depression. And I was going to answer another question, perhaps, and that was this question that Danielle posed about how does Mexican immigration relate to a broader immigration history? And that's a huge question, but I'll say a few things. One of them is that one of the things that various scholars from David Gutierrez to George Sanchez, two of my advisors, have mentioned is that there is this difference between Mexican immigration and, say, Asian immigration as well as European immigration because of the proximity of the U.S. to Mexico, right? Because of the U.S. shares a border with Mexico. So it's much easier for Mexican immigrants to participate in the so-called circular migration, coming to the U.S. for a period of time and then going back to Mexico and going back and forth up until 1986, when the militarization of the border ramped up. And then you have what I mentioned, which is that more and more Mexican immigrants are remaining in the U.S. because they can't participate in circular migration as easily. They can't cross the border if they're undocumented anymore as easily as they did before. So that's one of the issues that is different. Another one, and this is related, is that Mexican immigrants for a good part of the 20th century have had really low levels of naturalization, partly because of related to their sort of experience of wanting to return. to Mexico. So similar to what, Italian immigrants, right? The birds of passage, how they sort of had this attitude of, we're going to the US, as Danielle mentioned, to make some money, and then we're returning to our country of origin to start a business, to, buy a farm, to basically increase their social status, their social standing, right? And so Mexican immigrants basically had that idea as well for many years. And because it's closer to go to Mexico than it is to go travel to Europe or to Asia. That idea remained, in many immigrants' mind. But I think another thing I would say is that because of the proximity to the U.S., Mexican immigrants have continued to come throughout, since the end of the U.S.-Mexico War, since the mid-19th century, right? There have been waves of Mexican immigration throughout, since then, unlike, say, European immigration and also Asian immigration. And partly because, as Danielle mentioned, or I mentioned it, I think, in my paper, but the quota laws of the 1920s didn't apply. Danielle did mention it. They didn't apply to any immigrants from the Western Hemisphere, from the Americas. And that was mainly targeted, or that was mainly, that exemption was made partly to allow Mexicans to continue to come, because there's not that many, say, Salvadorans or Chileans coming to the US to work in the 1920s, right, when the quota laws were implemented. So that's another, I think, difference in the sense of, Mexican immigration has continued. And there hasn't been really sort of a time when it has dropped and just stopped, like it has with certain European immigrants or certain Asian immigrants. Okay, and I can answer other questions that Danielle posed, or I can wait for Shannon for you to pose other questions from the chat if you'd like.
Before we move on, Danielle, did you have anything to add to what Omar, responded?
No, I think those are great responses in terms of the audience question about forced repatriations. And I think all of those comments in response to my large question are great and along the lines of what I was thinking. And I would press you on one further point. Maybe you could comment on if you think that because of this continuous migration that has sort of occurred throughout the U.S.-Mexico relationship and the proximity of the border and the frequent border crossings, that we see a more sustained transnational identity or presence in this immigrant community as well.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And I mean, various scholars have written about this, right? Because, migrants were going back and forth. There was this idea that they would bring ideas and sort of their views of history, for example. This is part of what I'm writing about in my new book. To the U.S. and share it with people that they encountered, right, with Mexican Americans here, as well as when they would return to Mexico, and this is more the case in the 20th century, they would take sort of the culture that they had sort of absorbed, whether it was music or leisure activities, and also take those ideas with them, and when they return, there was this sort of transnational exchange of ideas, of culture, and it was very vibrant. And then, in the late 20th century, you have migrants returning to Mexico or to Central America, and it's very easy for instance, residents of, say, Mexican towns to notice which families have people abroad, living abroad, because those families not only have partly a higher standard of living through remittances, as you mentioned, but also when the migrants return, they return with sort of what Mexican nationals and other Latin Americans would say, where there are more agringados, they are more Americanized, right? They've become more Americanized either in the way they speak, in the way they dress, in the cars they bring home and sometimes leave. And then there's been cases of there's been these great studies of how Mexican migrants through remittances and this idea they have of, we're going to return home one day. They are working in, say, California or Texas, and some of them are working in construction, or even if they're not working in construction, they see the homes that exist in the area, and then they pay for someone to design homes just like the ones in Southern California suburbs, or in Texas suburbs, or Arizona suburbs. So you see all these homes in Mexican towns and cities that are sitting empty, waiting for these Mexican migrants to return, and some of them never do, partly because once they get married or establish families, it's very hard for these Mexican migrants to return, to convince their wives, to convince their children to go back to Mexico, or to the Dominican Republic, or to other Caribbean countries, right? And this has been the subject of popular songs by Los Tigres del Norte, for example, or also there's a great documentary on Dominican family in New York called My Dominican Girls, where the daughters are saying, we're never going to the Dominican Republic, even though our parents want us to go there, to live, because it's this generational gap, right? And they're American more than anything. They're not culturally Dominican as much as they are American. And the same thing happens with Central Americans, like Salvadorans or Nicaraguan children who are, I guess, Salvadoran Americans or Guatemalan Americans. So yeah, there is this sort of transnational exchange of ideas, and then with the internet and with cell phones, that's also going to just be amplified.
Go
Well, I want to get to a couple other questions, but I thought I would kind of organize this in a way. Let's conclude with some of these questions that are more about what's going on in America today, right now. Let's kind of conclude with that. I'd like to hear from you all, answers to a few of these questions. But we have a couple of great ones that have come in that I thought we could take a look at before that. And one came in the Q&A section from Kyle. Was there a significant difference between the Great Plains states in their responses and uses of Mexican workers, and have the states changed over time? And I might even just perhaps have you comment on, as I read your paper, Omar, and as I heard your comments, Danielle, how different was it for Latinx people in the border states than it was up in the Midwest or up in the Great Plains states? I mean, I'm assuming language was far less of a barrier, and did that have an impact? So I thought I see regionalism really coming out in this question and what was going on in my mind.
Sure, I'll take a stab, and I don't know if Danielle wants to also mention something, but so there's been several studies by, for instance, Dioniso Valdez, as well as others who've looked at this and said, one of the things that Latinos, or Mexican Americans at least, Mexican immigrants to the Midwest lack is this long history of a community being established there, right? So they're establishing new communities many times if they're coming either in the 1910s or the 1920s, and so they can't sort of plug into these organizations that have been there before, like mutual aid societies or civil rights organizations that might have been there for a while, or even churches, right, that have long established parishes that are predominantly Latino or Mexican American. So that's one of the differences. But another one is language, and I mean, one of the things I discovered when I wrote a short journal article on Iowa communities in the early 20th century, and one of the things I discovered is that many of these families, many of these migrants, and some of them were Mexican Americans who came from Texas to the Midwest, Iowa, but others were Mexican immigrants who were, Mexican nationals who came there. They end up many of them, the children are going to acculturate much quicker because there's not the predominance of sort of Spanish language media or Spanish language populations, right? So they're going to more rapidly learn English and more rapidly acculturate. So the children are oftentimes are going to intermarry with non-Latinos, non-Mexicans, where it's just going to be less the case, say, it's not out of the question, but it's less the case in places throughout the U.S. Southwest, because there's lots more Latinos there, lots more Mexicans. But the other thing I will mention is that I think there is this sense, and Zaragoza Vargas, a historian who's at UNC, has mentioned this often, is that many migrants to whether rural areas of the Midwest or to urban areas in the early 20th century often told interviewers, whether they were journalists or scholars interviewing them, why they moved to the Midwest. They often said, because there's less racism, direct racism here than there was in Texas. So many of them were coming from Texas or had been first worked in Texas for a few years before moving to the Midwest. And they just said, we don't experience that as much. There's sort of outright hostility. I mean, for a while there, during the Bracero program, Mexico actually prevented contract workers from going to Texas because they were treated so horribly. So here in this state, and so even though there was a large Latino population, right? So I think there's still that sense of among immigrants even today or migrants today that the Midwest is a more welcoming place. When I lived in Iowa, people, Latinos that I met there from various Central American countries as well as South American countries would say, we first moved to the U.S. and lived in Miami or lived in Los Angeles or lived in Washington, D.C., but we like it here because there's less, they would say there's less crime. There's, we have a higher standard of living. The housing is less expensive and so forth. But they also like the sort of the in some cases, if they lived in rural areas, the small town environment that reminded them of their home. So that is still a factor.
Danielle, did you have anything to add?
I don't have much to add, except, I agree with everything that Omar has said. And I would add, beyond the sort of racialized differences in the Southwest versus the Midwest, I think the key difference that I'm hearing in Omar's answer as well is really sort of urban versus rural divides and experiences, right? Because you're going to get more of the urban Midwestern experience than you are in the Southwest, right? And so I think that that's really sort of a way that you can differentiate experiences or that question, because when we're talking about Chicago's and Detroit's and even Omaha's, that's different than, say, talking about migratory circuits in Colorado or Texas or whatnot, right? Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Right, thanks. A real quick one, Danielle, could you note again the book that you recommended in your remarks?
It's Sybil Foxx, 3 Worlds of Relief, and she looks at Euro-American, African-American, and Mexican-American experiences during the Great Depression and the New Deal, and it's absolutely fascinating. She studies Mexican Americans largely in the Southwest and talks about the politics of marginalization there. Along with being sort of racialized as white, another thing that works for Euro Americans is that they're largely living in northeastern and Midwestern cities where urban political machines function and hand down patronage and are very comfortable asking the government for benefits to then distribute to citizens. And that's not the case in the American South, where conservative senators and congressmen do not want the federal government intervening in their affairs and the racial dynamics of employment there. And so that has a lot to do with the way that relief is divvied out during the Great Depression. There's also just sort of urban-rural divisions. I mean, if you're going to publicly fund the construction of an airport or a courthouse or a bridge, it's probably not in Chadron, it's probably in Omaha, right? So there are some of these sort of differences as well. So it's a really great book. The other one I would plug that, Omar got me thinking about was Sarah Lopez, The Remittance Landscape, where she follows migrants from Jalisco and how remittance money has remade the town and the social dynamics there. I never thought I would have so much fun reading about Home Depot, and it's sort of like international migrant circuits. So there's just really great work in this field.
Thanks, that's great. And Danielle, if you get a chance, could you put the
Sure.
title of that book up in the chat? That might help a couple of folks, because we've got multiple people who've asked about that. Before we kind of get to the meat of what's going on today. I did love this question that came in from Christy. During the Spanish-American War, as you had said, Mexican Spanish-speaking immigrants moved to the Midwest in the late 19th century. Were they treated kind of like during World War I when Germans were treated badly, or World War II Germans and Japanese? Was there any kind of cultural, societal ostracization or anything that you observed up in the Midwest, Omar?
Oh, during the Spanish-American War?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't know. Actually, that's a very good question. I wouldn't know. Partly, it's going to be hard for scholars to look at that just because of the low population numbers in 1898 in the Midwest. There's not going to be as many. I would probably imagine they'd have to look at, say, a place like Chicago, but I think trying to think of Gabriela Redondo has written a book, Mexican Chicago, which is a great book that also speaks about this low rates of naturalization among Mexicans. And I think she doesn't cover that far back. I think she probably begins at the turn of the century. But another great book I should mention, since we're plugging books, other people's books, is Lydia Fernandez wrote a book on Chicago, and she talked about the interactions between Puerto Ricans and Mexicans. And I think one of the reasons that the Midwest is sort of a burgeoning sort of field in Latino studies, especially for those scholars interested in inter-Latino relations, is because there hasn't been as much of a, in places like Chicago or Detroit, there isn't this predominance of sort of a Mexican population that there is in the Southwest, or predominance of a Puerto Rican population, like there might be in New York or other parts of the Northeast, or even the Cuban population like there is in Florida. So Latino populations are perhaps a little bit more evenly distributed, and so you have more alliances among different Latino groups.
That sort of answers towards the end of, we've got this question from Alice about what's happening today. How effectively are Latino immigrants organizing and working together? And is there a resistance to working together as a united front? And I think that you could possibly even draw a couple of conclusions about just what's happening in the United States, in the social atmosphere that we have today. And so I thought maybe Omar and Danielle and Kurt, I have a final comment for you. You're not going to be left out of this, but perhaps you've seen a few of the other questions. They're very much about what on earth is happening today. I'm sure people have in mind, the up and down of dreamers and things like that. So perhaps you could share your thoughts in that area.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think during the 2005-2006 protest, immigration protests, one of the things that was very revealing, I think, was that a lot of the activism came out of the Midwest, came out of places like Chicago and Detroit. And there were many of the students who were dreamers who were actively organizing and doing incredible actions that were very heroic actions, in the sense of they were coming out publicly and saying, I'm undocumented and I'm unafraid. Much of this organizing happened in Chicago, and among Latino immigrants from various backgrounds, or Latino youth of various backgrounds. And so I think that there is in the Midwest more alliances, more cross-Latino alliances between Puerto Ricans, Central Americans, and Mexicans than there are in other regions of the country. Partly because, as I mentioned, the population isn't skewed to one demographic or another. Just to put it in context, in the U.S. as a whole, Mexican Americans make up about close to 2/3 of all Latinos. And so part of why my essay is mainly about Mexican Americans at the beginning is because they've been in the country longer, right? Since the U.S.-Mexican War. Well, actually, before the the U.S.-Mexican War, since part of Texas was Mexico, right? And part of the U.S. Southwest was Mexico. So, but also their population is just much bigger. And then I think it used, Puerto Ricans are also a large population. And I think the next group used to be Cubans, but now I think they're Guatemalans or no, maybe Salvadorans, one of the Central American groups, but then Cuban Americans. And so, one of the other things that I didn't touch on because it was, I could only say so much in the paper is that there are also very, very stark differences between these populations. And even within, between Puerto Ricans and Mexican Americans, or and between them and Cuban Americans, right? Not only in their in their politics, but also in their educational levels, because of various factors. And so within the Latino population, there's a lot of diversity, internal diversity, and I just spoke on about a few of those.
Yeah.
I'll add some general comments that may or may not get at these questions. Right now, about 10% of American voters are naturalized citizens. There's about 23 million naturalized citizens who are poised to potentially vote in this election. Their turnout is comparable to US born, it's just slightly lower. And Mexican Americans make up 3.5 million of those naturalized voters, or 16% of all foreign voters in the United States. So those are just some sort of statistics about where sort of ethnic voters stand in this election. As to the question about immigrant rights and organizing, and how in the early 2000s there was a large Midwestern presence of Latinx voices, I think that we see that coalition shifting a little bit since 26, because immigration policy has just changed so much. The nature of it has changed, the tone around it has changed. So not only are we just talking about dreamers, where there was a strong Latinx presence, but now we're talking about things like travel bans, border detentions, asylum denials, the conflation of incarceration and detention, the criminalization of the immigration process itself. And so I think you're seeing these groups, these immigrant rights groups that started out in ethnic camps, number one, becoming pan-ethnic movements as Muslim Americans figure out what they have in common with Latinx Americans or Asian Americans. And you're seeing more religious humanitarian groups sort of getting into the fray. And I think broadening the ways in which we talk about some of these movements like dreamers. And, we could keep talking about that, but I'll just...
Yeah, honestly, we could have a whole 90-minute session just on contemporary issues and how the scholarship that you two have brought to the table kind of can be drawn into the stories of today. Unfortunately, folks, we're at the top of the hour and we're pretty well wrapping up here. I wanted to, when Kurt was sharing his just going through some of Mari's writing and the discussion of racial hierarchy, and of course she was a product of her times and how she wrote these things, but she wrote a comment in one of her last books, These Were the Sioux, that has stuck with me forever. And she wrote that as a young child, she found the Sioux to be no more unusual than the colorful palette of immigrant Poles, Czechs, Irish, Dutch, French, Germans, Danes, Swiss, a few Serbs, a Bulgar, a Mohammedan, a Negro, and Texas cowboys who visited her family ranch. So she had the Lakota and all of these other people. And so she grew up in this milieu. And so I think it's really appropriate that we have this conversation about immigration and especially immigration in the West and Midwest. And I am just so thrilled and honored to have had you three here to have this conversation. And unfortunately, as you can see, we have lots more questions that we weren't able to get to. And I don't know if any of them are simple enough for a quick response. You might type in Omar or Danielle or Kurt. But while I'm wrapping things up, I just want to thank everybody who did submit questions. And I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of them. But as we wrap things up, I just have a last little bit of housekeeping to share with you all. I do want to thank, in addition to these great speakers and panelists, I want to thank Luke Pawlowski, who's from Southeast Community College, who's supporting the technical platform, the Zoom platform that we're working on today. He's done a superb job of making us all very comfortable in this new world that we're using. And I want to thank Humanities Nebraska for their financial aid and promotional support. And of course, all of the people from the Mari Sandoz Heritage Society. In a normal era, one where we could all be face-to-face, the panelists and the keynote speaker and all the Sandoz board and guests would be heading on down for a drink at the Old Main Street Inn in Chadron, Nebraska, getting ready for the next day where we'd have a whole day of sessions. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to have a whole day of sessions, but fortunately, tomorrow night, same time, same place, same link on Zoom, we're going to have an incredible discussion about immigration and ethnicity in Western Nebraska with some local regional experts. And so I'm really excited for that one. And I hope you folks can join us there tomorrow when we have this talk. As a reminder, you're all going to get an email to follow up on this. And one of the links will be a survey. If you could please do this for us, it's very helpful as we explore the idea of doing more of these virtual events. And it's also helpful for us to respond to Nebraska Humanities, who provided us with some financial support. Also, you will get the link to the webinar recording, which will be coming, as well as just available on our website. And so on behalf of the Mari Sandoz Heritage Society, I want to say thank you to all of you attendees. We had over 100 in the peak of our talks. I want to thank Kurt, Danielle, and most especially you, Omar, for doing your research and presenting this fascinating topic. I think it's just been great, and we were honored to have all three of you. So take care, everybody, and stay safe out there. And I hope next year we can see you all face to face. Thanks again.
Thank you.